What could the so-called father of existentialist philosophy, Soren Kierkegaard, have to say about a classical doctrine of divine immutability, and what, maybe more importantly, would that have to do with modern life? Well, this one gets a little heady, but let me tell you what I thought about Craig Hefner's new book on Kierkegaard and the changelessness of God. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I just finished a review copy of Craig Hefner's new book, Kierkegaard and the Changelesness of God, from IVP Academic. Thank you to IVP for sending this book for my review. Let me take you through my typical format of the main idea, research, readability, and my reaction to this. So the main idea of this book is an attempt to bridge the philosophical work of Soren Kierkegaard, or Kierkegaard, if I'm pronouncing that right, the philosophical work of Kierkegaard, and a much more, something that's not typically associated with him or philosophers of the existentialist kind of stripe, which is the idea of God's immutability, or the changelessness of the divine. Those two things aren't typically, at least in my understanding, they're not typically talked about in the same kind of breath. And so Hefner is trying to make a case that Kierkegaard actually is a defender of the immutability of God, even in his own writings, which are more what we retroactively kind of label as existentialist. So this is, if you can't tell already, this is geared towards someone who's going to be a little bit more, at least, if not well versed in philosophy, at least interested in more rigorous philosophical kind of argumentation. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about when I use terms like existentialism and immutability, and you aren't really very familiar with Kierkegaard, then maybe you'll know right away whether or not this one is for you. I did like this book, just to kind of telegraph my conclusion a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit more about why. So the main idea is essentially to argue that you can look at Kierkegaard's writings as a philosopher and actually get to the conclusion that a sense of God's divine immutability is actually really, really important. Importantly, for the purposes of Hefner's argument, you can get there without going through typical metaphysical argumentation or metaphysical discourse, like really abstract, esoteric kind of analytical discussions about the nature of the divine, which is typically how people get at the doctrine of divine immutability. Kierkegaard, he argues, you can get there through his writings without going through any sort of that metaphysical reflection. Which is, as I'm someone who's interested in these ideas, that is a really interesting idea to me, and that's part of the reason I was wanting to review this book. So there you go. That's my attempt to encapsulate the main idea here. Quickly, the research behind this is, I don't know if this was an adapted dissertation, but it kind of reads like one, and that your mileage with that is going to vary. All I'm trying to say is that he is deeply, deeply immersed in Kierkegaard's writings, and it feels like a PhD level research project in that sense. He's very conversant in Kierkegaard's writings. Kierkegaard is infamously difficult to interpret because he wrote under so many pseudonyms, and it's hard to know, was this pseudonymous voice representing a view that Kierkegaard himself held, or was he representing it to argue against it? It can make Kierkegaard a little impenetrable sometimes when you try to think what did the actual figure, the actual person think. But I think Hefner does a really good job at understanding all of that. He makes effective claims, or makes claims that are at least plausible, many times persuasive, when it comes to establishing Kierkegaard's original thought. And he's very, very conversant in Kierkegaard. He's very conversant in interpreters of Kierkegaard as well. It's all well footnoted and cited, and you can do deeper dives into any of the stuff that particularly interests you. But it reads like something that was an academic kind of heavy lift in terms of the research. So you might be wondering then about the readability of it, which is the next thing I like to comment on. The readability, I'm going to say that the readability of this one, if you kind of plotted a spectrum of like super popular level to difficult to penetrate style, I would say it's not on either of those poles. It skews maybe slightly towards the academic style. It's not difficult to understand, but the nature of the material is very heady. I mentioned that Kierkegaard's not always the easiest to understand anyways, let alone interpretations of him. And And this I would say it's somewhere in the murky middle, maybe tilting a little bit towards the more academic or drier style. I wouldn't want that to put off the interested reader, because I don't want to overstate that. I don't think that it's definitely not impenetrable. I understood it quite well, but it's a little dense at times, a little on the drier side at times. And I will reiterate my thing at the beginning that if this is like a complete intro to you to either Kierkegaard or immutability or any of that, this may not be the starting point. This might be something to do after you've familiarized at least a little bit with some of those concepts. But if you are versed in, especially if you're versed in Kierkegaard, I would say that the kind of distinctive argument that Hefner is bringing here, I think that you as a reader would really, really appreciate this book, because it's unlike, to my knowledge, it's unlike a lot of other things that are being discussed or argued when it comes to Kierkegaard's work. So that's a bit on the readability of it. Okay, finally, just to sum this all up, my reaction to this book. I already mentioned I liked this book. I appreciated this book. It nuanced my understanding of Kierkegaard in a significant way, I would say. But I want to say another thing about why I was interested in this. And I've considered doing a video or a couple videos on some specific aspects of my own theological journey, if that would be of interest to anybody watching. It's something I've thought about, and as it relates to this book, a significant part of my own theological journey has been coming around to a lot more classical ideas and classical doctrines about God. I've been through a journey of a very, very kind of typical conservative evangelical American tradition, and then I've explored ideas like open theism and process philosophy and found some aspects of all that stuff very compelling, and actually was convinced by certain pieces of it. And then I've wound through that. I've come out of that. I wouldn't say I'm there anymore, and I would say I've actually rediscovered a lot of deep classical ideas like divine immutability. And I've started to understand in a second naivete kind of way, a new way, how beautiful and compelling and actually, remarkable divine immutability is, and what it actually means, and how it bears on a life of faith and the flourishing life of people, how important those ideas are, and the reason that they've stood the test of time of centuries of philosophical and theological work. And so all I'm trying to say is that my coming around to an interest in divine immutability, and alongside, I've had a long-standing pre-existing interest in Kierkegaard and read a bunch of biographies of him and some of his work. Those two interests have always existed in parallel tracks for me, and they've never really been explicitly brought together. And so when I saw this project, I thought, whoa, that is a really fascinating way to kind of bring some threads of my own theological journey together in one project. So I was really interested in it. I never heard of Craig Hefner before. I was not expecting a book like this to kind of pop up on my radar, and it did. And I'm very pleased to say that I really, really liked it. And I think that in general, this is where I want to kind of conclude my whole review. I love the idea of getting at divine immutability without the metaphysical discourse, metaphysical argumentation, like I talked about a minute ago. I love that idea. Had never even thought, it was possible, frankly. I know it just was not something I really considered it, even as a philosophical project. And yet, here it is. Hefner has used the writings of Kierkegaard, I think, very, very intelligently to get at the importance of divine immutability. And I said in that very, very beginning intro that I teed up the question, what does this have to do with like normal life? Because a lot of this esoteric, heady, cerebral stuff, philosophical ramblings, can feel so utterly disconnected from real lived life. And existentialism is deeply concerned with human experience, right? And so I will say that the ways that Hefner breaks down the idea of the disintegrated self, which is very, very popular lingo in kind of introspective psychological identity discourse today in our current culture, the disintegrated self in the Kierkegaardian sense. He talks about that in a very, very helpful way. And then he also draws out things like the self's narrative, the self's telos, the self's intention, and how those things disintegrate when they are grounded in a world that is fundamentally unstable, a world that changes, to put it simply. When you ground yourself, your sense of your own self-narrative, your own self-intention, and your will and your purpose, any attempt to root those things in our changing world, our inherently unstable world, is going to disintegrate the self. And the way to an integrated self depends on an immutable, unchanging divine, an unchanging God. And I found that to be a surprising argument. I found it to be really persuasive, really, and really compelling, just on a personal, existential, experiential sense. And so this is a really pleasant surprise. This book is a very pleasant surprise for me. Not with everything I said about the research and the readability and everything in the rear view. I wanted to put this video out there to give those of you watching a sense of whether or not this might be something you would want to spend some time with. If you resonate at all with my theological journey that I just talked about, or if you like Kierkegaard, or both, especially both, then definitely pick up Craig Hefner's book, Changelesness, Kierkegaard and the Changelesness of God. I think it's another facet in my own ongoing journey back into kind of a classical doctrines of God. And so I really appreciate it for that sense. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on this book. I hope that was helpful to you. If you're watching this, hope that maybe will point you to a helpful resource for your own reading and your own reflection. But as always, thank you for watching.